Thank you for inviting me to your home, Paul. It's great to be with you.
It's totally my pleasure, Neil. Thank you. It's great having you here.
We talked in January about having a conversation about various matters, various metaphysical matters, one of which was the arrival and the transition and the departure of the 21st of December 2012. Of course, 2012 has been a big point in the calendar for a lot of people for many years now. On the surface level, one cannot help but notice that it came and went. Evidently, a lot of things for a lot of people are rather still the same as they were before, aren't they? What did you feel when that day came?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I actually had a ceremony here in this very room that we're sitting in with a whole bunch of people who came together to celebrate on the 21st of December. And it's funny because in my life, half the people I know are of the opinion, wow, there was nothing that happened on that day. Mm. And then the other half of the people I know are like, oh my God, everything shifted, consciousness just really expanded and all that. And so it really depends who you talk to about, what actually happened. But one thing that I've noticed is that, and I've been saying this to people, that whole process that we've all been to whatever degree postponing, coming to terms with, whether it's looking at our shadow or dealing with our dysfunction or stuff we've been just postponing till tomorrow to look at, it really feels like that's becoming more and more impossible to do, that any of the stuff that we really have to look at as far as dealing with and assimilating into our wholeness, that's there's no getting around coming to terms with that.
I've seen a very similar thing. If somebody were to say to me, well, what characterized 2012 and the end of that cycle for you, it was that people's stuff came up really hard and fast from the depths, really.
Yeah, exactly.
And I heard so many stories about men saying, I can't do this job anymore, I don't want to do it, I want to get out of the workplace, or women's, I don't want to be with this man anymore, or someone who'd had an illness who had to face it, somebody who was in love with somebody who said, hey, I love you, I need just to tell you, whatever that big dramatic thing was, usually a difficult thing, usually something that they were unsure of. A lot of that stuff just blew up in people's faces, and the people who'd been kind of working at it, it worked out all right. The people who'd been spending the conscious energy in a certain manner to look at those things, as that energy came and brought it to the surface, it was beneficial, whereas the people who had been absolutely blocking it had a really difficult time because that stuff resisted their attempt to block it, and just there was nothing they could do. That energy came and changed people's domestic situations, the sleep patterns changed, the diets changed, the skin, the hair. Lots of different people experienced quite physical, dramatic things. It wasn't like this fourth dimensional ray came down, or the motherships landed, or the Pleiadian Brotherhood came and waved hello to us. Those things didn't happen, but I would say that what did happen was more dramatic than that, because people's personal lives really shifted, really transitioned, and it did seem to be around, I would say, October, November, December, critical time for that. A lot of people now are dealing with the aftermath of that and are asking questions of, well, I've dealt with what I don't want to do, and now I have to deal with the very tricky but lovely dilemma in a way of, what do I want to do?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, as you were talking, Neil, I kept on thinking, there are so many people in my field that I've known who've been really focusing for years on the whole December 21st, 2012 thing. And, under the context of, the light coming in. Another thing that I've noticed is that it seems like that the darkness, that you could say even like this evil energy has become even more materialized, more manifest in a way that's impossible just to play an ostrich and ignore, but not only inside of each one of us, but out on the world stage. It's as if, archetypal evil has come out from hiding in the underground or in the corners or in the shadows, and is fully manifest, fully visible for anybody who has eyes to see. And that seems to be somehow related to the coming of the light, as if the light coming in is making the darkness visible, and that something is actually being shown to us in that process.
Well, it forces people to consider what are the positives and negatives in their life. The typical Christian version or interpretation of evil is not something I buy necessarily, but we can use the word evil as a shortcut, I guess, and everybody understands what that is. But that destructive, malevolent force in people's lives, I agree, does indeed seem to be more evident, as it is, of course, on the television and in the newspapers and on the radio or whatever. There's no doubt about it. And it's kind of difficult to ignore now. And as you say, even those who have successfully used the head in the sand strategy for the whole life are finding that that's not really feasible anymore. They are being compelled to look at the things that cause pain, to look at the things that symbolize their own darkness. In thinking about that, it makes you contemplate the relationship between internal shadow and external shadow. And whereas perhaps somebody like you and I, that's our business, that's what we do, I am finding that this part of my work is actually a very common contemplation at the moment, in that even almost the man in the street is starting to consider the relationship between all the bad things in the world and the unacknowledged, unconscious things within themselves, which I think is just a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're describing, how what's playing out in the outer world is somehow correlated to, or like a reflection of what's happening inside of us, that's the description of a dream. And that's why it's not just a metaphor that I'll use, is that, it's as if we're having a mass shared, a collective dream that we're all dreaming up into manifestation. And the interesting thing is, when you see what's happening in that way, and I should also add the language of dreams, or it speaks in the language of symbols. When you see the world as if it's a dream, you discover, wow, so here this darkness, this shadow, this evil is manifesting, that's a reflection of something in us, so it's actually revealing this hidden part of ourselves to us. So one other way of saying that is that encoded in this seeming manifestation of the darkness, of evil, is actually some form of blessing that is actually potentially helping us to wake up. That's a radical point of view.
I smile when you say that, because we're placing our hands on the same sacred object of wisdom here, aren't we? We're standing around this circle and we're putting our hands on it and we're seeing the same thing. There's absolutely no question in my mind anymore that the destructive, negative, malevolent parts of the universe are gifts of revelation and insight and divinity wrapped in this rather unpleasant crisis packaging, And it's usually some sort of collapse in somebody's life. Most people can identify with what it means to lose family or lose a loved one in a relationship, or to be in a relationship that finishes, obviously a sadness and a melancholy in that. Everybody knows what that feels like. And things in the commercial world like difficulties in business and bankruptcy and so on, those things inevitably bring people to a new point of perception through absolute necessity. And in the groups that I speak to and in the individuals that I speak to, most people will tell me some sort of story along those lines. I'm sure you must come across this. And they'll say, at first it was a disaster, at first that was it, I was at the bottom, life was over. But as is so often the case in life, you have to touch the bottom before you can push back up again, right? Yeah. And then as they did that, as they surfaced and drew air in, they thought, wow, that was so important, because it gave me a radical course correction. I'm not a businessman. I'm not just this guy. I'm not just this woman whose life is difficult and thorny. I am an amazing, incredible, sacred entity on this massive adventure. And it takes a lot of self-belief and persuasion of ourselves to accept that, because for a lot of men, particularly in the 40s and 50s and 60s, that is just a dream. That's nonsense talk. That's woo-woo, new age, hocus pocus. But there is this cohesion in the shadow and in the darkness, and in the destructiveness. There is something valuable there that we can't ignore.
Yeah, it's so funny, just as you're talking, I mean, it's so activating my psyche, because you're really speaking the same language. And it makes me think, like, one of the things that I think about a lot is that, so here, as a species, we're acting out on the world stage our unconscious in a way we're actually destroying ourselves. And that's beyond debate. When you think about we're destroying the biosphere, the life support system of the planet. But I point out that encoded in that process of destroying ourselves, that we're actually potentially teaching ourselves how to not destroy ourselves, which we clearly haven't understood yet, or we wouldn't be destroying ourselves. So the point being that encoded in our acting out our unconscious shadow part is something being shown to us. But it's very quantum in that, well, will we destroy ourselves or will we wake up? Well, just like is light a wave or a particle, that's what I mean about it being quantum, in that, well, it depends how we observe it, how we dream it. It depends if we recognize what's being shown to us by actually what we're dreaming up. And that's really, we both have our own particular ways of saying that, but that really is the question. Are we going to recognize what's being shown to us?
Well, as you say, as you speak, it's firing off new thoughts in me as well, and old thoughts as well, a nice balance of the two. I have to observe that with that witnessing of destruction, what we start to understand is what is the place of destruction in the universe. And as I have said recently to people, just as a very simple metaphor really, that destruction can be a wonderful thing. To have a supernova, or to demolish a house to make way for a lovely new house, or a necessity to cut down a tree, a living being, to do something important, to create life for new trees, for example, in a forest or whatever. Without destruction, endless creation is a big problem, because you just end up with a universe full of stuff and you've got a big problem on your hands. So you have to have some place where things go away, a deletion and a creation. I neutralise those concepts in that very simple way to say that the pulse of the universe is emanation and recession, to manifest and to erase. We tend to cling to manifestation and we cling to creation, as indeed our Buddhist teachers have tried to show to us, that attachment itself generates a dilemma. And I think that if nothing else, the lesson of destruction is to say, don't try to avoid this, but try to understand what it is and what its purpose is in the universe, to take things away. The malevolence attached to it is a conscious element that is largely a human projection. Not entirely, is largely a human projection. But the idea that there is only human consciousness at the top of that cycle is something that I have found very difficult to stick with. That isn't the case. I see that the order of the universe, the ecology of the universe, is vast and is very, very diverse and very rich. Human consciousness is one element of that, and there are lots of other ones, which is a very sticky subject, isn't it, for us to talk about. It's not possible for me to say anymore that this is all the mind, aberrations of the mind, projections of human consciousness. I see consciousness not as a human thing, but just as a thing in itself. And there is, as you put it, this quantum element of consciousness, which is particle at one point, wave at another point as necessary. But everything feeds into that. The rocks feed into that. The humans feed into that. The Pleiadians feed into it. But let us say that there are all these different life forms around the universe. Everybody feeds into that field. So to imagine that all the evils of the world are just humans being bad, I think is inadequate, that answer.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you mentioned field, and because as you were talking, I was thinking, the whole non-local field, which pervades everything and contains everything. And the implication of the non-local field is that, there's no separation anywhere between any part of the universe and any other part. And if I could just go back to something you had said, in the sense of you were talking about, and we were talking about the whole sort of destructive energy in the universe as being a part of the greater whole of the universe. And it made me think, then there is the whole idea of, I can talk for me, as an artist, I know when I'm not accessing and expressing the creative spirit in me, that's when I act out in a self-destructive way. And what the meaning of that is for me is that, oh, one way of, or maybe the way of really coming to terms with, we're talking about evil, is to get in touch with our creative expression of who we are. One of the most sort of destructive processes in us is unexpressed creativity. And the idea of creativity is tapping into something that's beyond ourselves. And I just know for me, when I'm all of a sudden, I'm writing a new article or I'm doing a drawing or whatever, it's when I feel most alive and most awake, and I'm in this timeless state, and it's effortless, and it's as if all of a sudden I've become some sort of conduit for something that's beyond myself to somehow come through and give shape and form to itself in a way as if it existed already in the atemporal dimension, and somehow I've been able to access it and channel it in a way and give it form. And yeah, I'm the artist in that way, but it's also not something that's of me. It's something beyond me. And I think this is what you're kind of pointing at, that we're interfacing with something that's not just a personal energy, but something transpersonal or archetypal that pervades everything.
It is, as you talk about creativity being particularly relevant, not just as something that's nice to do or something that is a pleasing pastime or a hobby, but is actually part of the core purpose of a human being. And I think it causes us to reframe what we mean when we say being creative, and you're pointing at it in what you say, which is, well, what are we doing when we're being creative? Is we're opening up a little portal, a little stargate to another dimension, essentially. Perhaps where our fourth density self, or our higher self, or our core soul, or whatever you want to call it, can speak to us in more multidimensional, true terms. If I am working with people who have problems with depression or psychic stasis, where there's nothing happening and they're just the same, and there's this dreary humdrum routine of life and it's grinding them, I often examine for that individual, well, what are you doing? What is your engagement with life? How are you contributing? What shapes are you putting into life that are new? What textures are you drawing attention to that haven't previously had attention drawn to them? I.e., what is your creative input into life? Where there's none, people can easily fall into not being creative, because I have to say that what I term the control system discourages creativity to a very large extent, and instead replaces it with heavy consumption, doesn't it? It saturates us with images. You go to the store, you go to the computer store, you switch on the television, and there's all these colours and shapes and sounds and music and culture and all this stuff dripping from the page and the screen. But we're not being asked to participate in that, we're just being asked to drink it up, to just consume it. And so a lot of people fall into the understandable conceit, I would say, and I've included myself in that many times, believe you me, of forgetting that there's a balance required here, in that we do enjoy consuming wonderful books, and we know of all different kinds of those that we could share, wonderful movies, lovely nature documentaries, fantastic CDs of the great musical artists and virtuosos. There's no doubt about that, how joyous that is. But we have a valuable part to play in that dynamic. And I think it's of increasing importance for people to realise that the universe is constantly inviting you to contribute, to participate, to engage. And whether you pick up a paintbrush or a guitar or a pen or a laptop or a drumstick is sort of up to you and sort of arbitrary. It doesn't matter what it is. And we might identify ourselves as writers, for example. But you know as well as I do, really what you're doing is engaging with creation. You're looking at creation at the most foundational level you can, and you're expressing that through a gift of words, through a gift of the pencil or whatever. But that's not important. The engagement is what's important.
Yeah. No, it's not the medium at all that's important. And that's why, I even wrote an article a few years ago. It was called "The Artist as the Healer of the World." And it's pointing at that it's the archetypal figure of the artist who is actually, the one who is going to be bringing, the really healing of the world to actually take place. And it makes me think of who we are, because that's, one of the key questions. in a sense, we're all these artists and like dreamers, and our canvas is this universe. And like you were saying, Neil, and it's just so cool. I just want to meta-communicate for a second. Like hearing you talk, it's like I'm sitting with a part of myself, and as you're like channeling your thought forms, I feel like, oh my God, the psychedelic is taking effect, and I'm just getting super activated, you know, in a way that is just really cool to have like somebody to collaborate with in this way. And it's so interesting because one of the things you said, it made me think of, yeah, we're being invited by the cosmos to participate in our own evolution. To the extent that we see the dreamlike nature of this reality, one thing that means is that there's nothing outside of us that exists in an objectively, independently existing way, but that you can't separate out our own consciousness from what we're experiencing as the outside world, which is to say that somehow what we're experiencing moment by moment, that it's a function of consciousness. It's a function in a way of our divine creative imagination. And when you begin to see that, you begin to see, oh wow, I'm actually co-creating this universe with itself. Talk about a creative venture. And that's where, when you see that, you then are met with the question of, okay, I'm seeing this as a dream. Well, how do I want to dream it? But not I as the ego, as like this reference point, but I who I've now discovered myself to be, which is actually not separate from the whole dream. And that's an interesting question. When I, through my imagination, when I imagine into that question, how would I dream the dream? That's when I get to the point of like, well, if there's still people who aren't really awakening, then it wouldn't be fully satisfying. So that's where, for me, it enters into the whole bodhisattvic idea of, oh, I get it. I won't be fully healed and awake until the whole universe is awake, because that's who I'm discovering that I am. And that's really inspiring to me, because that all of a sudden catapults me out of my separate self into an identity where I'm more here to actually serve other people and the whole. And paradoxically, by doing that, that very stance is the point of view that really alleviates my own suffering.
It is, and it's also the thing that brings happiness.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Because now you've stopped pursuing happiness, should you ever have fallen into that illusion like most humans do at some point or another. When your function is good, i.e. that you realise that there is this entity, Paul Levy, but there is also this coalescence of vectors which brings a lot of things together in the universe and touches dimensions close together, brings people close together. And to use your word, there is this kind of meta-self which you could superimpose over yourself, but we realise that it is nothing to do with the ego. When you redefine what you are, happiness is just always available. And as I said recently on a recording, you actually have to turn it down sometimes, happiness. Say, look, I'm going to turn that down for now because I'm busy. I'm trying to focus on something. I can't be jumping around with this, jubilation or whatever. So you realise, as I often say, happiness is like this kind of secret radio station that's always playing, always there, always on, all the time, and it's wonderful. The music is the sweetest, happiest thing in the universe. And all you have to do is turn the volume up or down. It's always there. It's not something that you pursue. It's always there. That idea that the dream, and obviously this plays into a lot of your methodology and terminology and whatnot. I was talking with an Australian guy a few weeks ago, and he has knowledge of the Aboriginal peoples in his area, the indigenous shamanic peoples of the Australian continent. And obviously the dream time is a big deal with those guys. And they perceive it exactly the reverse that we do. And I wrote an essay about this many, many years ago. It was about these people, the Ananu, and about the dream time, where it is considered that this really is the temporary, weird, surreal, creative, dynamic dream bit. And the other thing that we go to at night, the other world, the underlying superstructure, is actually where we are in a more real sense. Yeah. And so that turns one on to the idea that these guys who were thinking this 40,000 years ago, before anybody was even interested in writing it down, were saying the dreamlike nature of this is here to show us the power, the effects, the depth of consciousness and what it actually can do to the universe. And I have found that creation is a work in progress, and that this great divinity, this great source has said, look, this isn't finished, guys. This is still going on. The process is evolving, and you're part of it. The invitation is always open, because it's a hell of a lot better when you participate in it. And so the evolutionary refinement of the universe is as reliant on us as it is on the stars, the planets and the oceans and the birds and the other life forms in the universe. It says, if you take part in this, it makes for a better creation, a better music.
We can't not take part in it. It's like...
But that's what creates the dissonance, isn't it? Because, as you say, fundamentally you cannot choose to opt out, really. But when you do, when you try and cocoon yourself away from it, that's what starts to create the problems, isn't it?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the place where then all of a sudden, because we're somehow not awake to that, we're actually participating and actually co-creating with our experience. That's when our experience will shapeshift and become negative or destructive or problematic, or will develop symptoms or whatever. But when we actually begin to wake up to, oh, I get it, moment by moment, I'm actually participating in the experience of myself and of actually co-creating myself through the divine creative imagination, or whatever you want to call it, that's when you all of a sudden can connect with your power in a way where, instead of your own intrinsic, you could say, genius being turned against us in a self-destructive way, you're able to tap into it in a way that serves you and that serves the highest.
And that requires a shift in perception, where you give yourself permission to be creator, and you give yourself permission to channel this divinity through yourself and say, maybe it is okay that I can change the dream. It is suggested to us through our lives that it isn't okay to change the dream.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is to work very, very hard until you're 65 and then retire and go and play golf in Florida. That's the dream of the system.
Yeah.
It takes a radical move of consciousness that perhaps some people, perhaps yourself included, naturally it was okay for you to make that radical move. But for a lot of people who have heavy investment in the system, to believe in themselves that they have the authority to change the dream is quite a shift, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, I was interviewed like a few weeks ago by someone, and we got exactly to this point where I began talking about, and then once you see the dreamlike nature, you can change the dream. And he responded in the interview like, well, how come you'd want to do that? And I looked at him and I said, well, you've woken up in the dream and you see that we're killing ourselves. Would you change that dream, or would you just leave it the way it is?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because what you just said, Neil, made me think about, when I began, in the early 80s, having the recognition of the dreamlike nature and beginning to wake up to my own part in it, and that I was actually responsible in a certain way and co-creating it or invoking it in a certain way. As I was more and more stepping into that energy of truly being in myself, in touch with my power, and really integrating my lucidity, what I also noticed was that simultaneous to that realization seemed to also be evoked certain almost darker forces that seemed to be contrary to that, or seemed to be in opposition to that. And that was very interesting to me. It was almost like the two reciprocally co-arose together, the light of lucidity and the darker powers that seemed to stop that had an investment in stopping that. It was almost as if the darker powers were feeding on the lack of lucidity or something. There was something going on there that really got my attention. I've more and more been trying to shed light on what is the nature of those darker forces. And one of the things, just in real simple terms, that I've discovered in my own process is that, it doesn't seem to be an error that there are these darker forces, that seems to be almost part of the deeper cosmic equation that's important for us to really understand. And
just let me interject at that point. That's very, very important what you're saying in terms of interactions with people who we talk to and seek our counsel and guidance in these matters, in that there is, again, a perspective involved here where you realise that the darkness amplified as your lucidity deepened, say. And your reaction was, oh, that's a very, very healthy response, isn't it? Because other people's response, which is very understandable, is, oh my God, this demon world is opening itself up to me, and I am now being stalked, and there's things after me, and this door has opened into another world, and I just want to slam it shut again.
Right. Yeah, and it makes me think of, I just remember after I had, this whole awakening experience in 81, and then very quickly that door opened and all the darker forces came in, and I remember I was fortunate to connect with these great spiritual teachers from Tibet. And I would see them all the time, and, because I was in so much pain and suffering, and I would share with them the fact that there were these darker forces and demons that were really like troubling me or disturbing me or just in my awareness. And they kept on saying, oh, well, it's because you have such potential for light that the darker forces are even interested. That if you didn't have such a potentiality for light, they wouldn't be at all interested to come and hang out with you. So they were also seeing, the deeper alchemy and the correlation between the darker and the light. And you're right, too, for people, and it's understandable, who once that door opens and all of a sudden we experience these seemingly, whether you call them demons or psychologically Jung calls them autonomous complexes, or Native Americans call it Watiko. There are all these different names. The Gnostics might call them the archons, or whatever the name is. It's unimportant. But you're right that if we then, resist them and close the door, and then we're fighting against them, that unwittingly is feeding them. That they're actually here to show us something. And like I was saying, it's not an accident that they're showing up. But if we can somehow get in relationship with them in a way where we receive what they're revealing or the message, they can actually feed our light. And that's very interesting to me.
It is, because you flip in the dynamic. What I see for a lot of people is that when they realise that there are these negative entities in the world that, as you say, we have all these different words for and these different terms for, which in the mainstream are meant to not exist, of course, or at best they are a psychological faculty of the mind. There's some aberration of the brain or whatever. But as you go deeper into this awakening, you realise that no, they do actually have sentience of their own, and they have their own self-determination and their own life and whatnot. When you realise that, I think that's when you start to feel the presence, of course, but that's where you get the opportunity to flip something round, which is this. When you're not aware of that, you are food for those negative entities, because I very much have come to the conclusion that these negative entities, God bless them, use low resonance consciousness as food, right? Because they're stuck where they are, and the universe won't allow them to just stay there without anything, so they need a power source. So they use low resonance consciousness, of which planet Earth at the moment is a super source of that stuff. And as soon as you question that equation and you turn to face them and say, hey buddy, who are you? What do you think you're doing? Because I'm a sovereign being, self-determined. They're losing a unit of resource there. They're losing a node on their network. And so they react to that. And so the reaction is something that is a good thing, because you flip it around. And you start to say, well, actually now, not only do I become very unappetizing to you at this moment, but I might use you for my own awareness.
No, what I was going to say is exactly that, is that instead, because that metaphor of us being food for them through our, unawareness or our fear, that's exactly it. And yet when we actually turn the light of awareness on them and see their nature, in a sense, then their energy becomes food for us, and their energy actually feeds our empowerment. And so it's interesting, because I just wrote a book about the importance of shedding light on the darkness. That, because I know so many, I think we probably both do, really well-intentioned, these new age metaphysical people who are really into the light, but they don't want to at all have anything to do with the darkness, because God forbid, if I put my attention on the darkness, they tell themselves a story that's going to feed the darkness. But what they don't realize is that because they're avoiding the darkness out of fear, that's actually feeding the darkness. The idea being that if you see the darkness, if you put your light of awareness on it, and then, like you were saying, as a sovereign being, we then have a choice. Well, once we see it, of course, you don't want to become overly fascinated by the darkness because that feeds it, but you don't want to avoid the darkness. But when you actually see its nature and how it operates, then as a sovereign being, we can choose how do we want to invest our awareness. And at that point, we can decide, I want to create the world I want to live in. And that's actually to really dispel, the darker forces.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is so good. When you see these extraordinary orders of nature which are undocumented in the mainstream, when we encounter those beings, I think that we have a very amplified tendency to go one way or the other, to say, oh my God, this is a nightmare, right, I'm not doing this anymore. Or to go warrior style, I will destroy you, I will combat you, I will take Christ's silver sword and cleave forth to... Both of those things, to submit or to dominate or to retreat or to surge forward, create dramas and difficulties. And I think one of the things, again, is embedded into what we've said, which is to go, interesting. To have the sort of Sherlock Holmes attitude, to not get all excited and get our knickers in a twist about a situation, but be absolutely super cool and just witness it and say, that's interesting. Yeah. And that neutrality, I mean, it is coolness, but that neutrality suddenly creates this great balance and equilibrium which withdraws you from that equation of polarization, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You're not polarizing yourself anymore. You don't go into retreat. You don't go into combat. You stand at, as the Native Americans say, you stand at the center, which is the point of power. In the eye of the hurricane there, you're at tremendous stillness, and yet you can draw on this enormous power of all the wind and the tremendous energy that surrounds you.
Yeah. No, that's so good, because what you're saying, it makes me think, like I've been really thinking a lot about how like this evil that we're trying to like come to terms with, that it feeds on polarization, that's its signature. And so if we try to fight it, we've already lost. And it makes me think of a couple of things. The first thing, one of my teachers from Tibet was here a number of years ago, and he was giving this empowerment, like this ceremony, where he transmits blessings. And it was a particular ceremony having to do with, it was going to dispel black magic. And he, during the empowerment, he gave the instructions, and he actually confided in us. He says, this empowerment won't really dispel black magic, because to even think that way is to be under the spell of black magic, because you're making it real. But what it'll do, it will dispel your belief in black magic, because that's the real black magic, the fact that we even think that there's something evil that we need to fight against. And then that brings me into, in my book I talk about that the real ultimate solution to the problem of dispelling evil is to get in touch with the part of ourselves, within ourselves, that's invulnerable to its effects. And that's what you just described about that eye of the hurricane. There are a lot of different metaphors for it. And that's the part of us that evil can't possess, because it's not possessible. And it's something that we possess because we can't not possess it. It's who we are. And it's just a question of really becoming familiar with that and really recognizing that. And as more and more we stabilize that realization and abide and rest in that, then any of these evil forces that are invested in self-destruction or whatever can't harm us at all. And I think that's a really important point to just bring out.
Absolutely crucial, that, because it plays into this dynamic that I see over and over again, which is having that confidence to look into yourself and speak to people like us and other people who do work like we do, and gain the knowledge, gain the knowing is a better way of saying it, gain the knowing that yes, we do have that invulnerability, we do have that inviolable spirit, which is, as you might think, a spark of the divine or a piece of source, something infinite, something eternal, which in my reading of the history of this conflict is what creates the resentment of those negative entities, because we have something that they don't have, which is a point of balance which is the compass-bearing home, as I call it, which is you go out on your vast journey into the universe and then you come home again, okay? Let us imagine for a moment that as a mental model of what happens over millions of years in our life, and we play different roles and we're different beings and we do all kinds of stuff on that journey. And the compass bearing that gets us home is this spark, is this point of equilibrium which we always regain, we always retain, and it is this innocence. In Gnosticism they often refer to those who possess this as the innocent little spirits. As they come back with that spark, with that kind of, I call it spiritual GPS, which gets us home again, beings who lack that, entities who lack that for all different kinds of complex reasons, have a great bitterness when they see it. And so it's not necessarily Paul or Neil that they're railing against and are in conflict with. It's something we have. And that, particularly in the Gnostic materials, through the 50-odd Nag Hammadi tractates, you'll see over and over again the word resentment, bitterness, hatred. You think, well, why would they possibly have hatred and resentment for us puny little fragile humans who are just beginning our spiritual journey in a way? And it's because we have something that is of great value in the universe, which is this return ticket, essentially, which not everything has, I have come to see. And that's the thing that creates the sense of being violated or being, if like your home gets burgled, heaven forbid, that it's not so much that you've lost your jewellery and your television, it's the fact that somebody's been in your house. You feel as though your space has been violated. And a lot of people, when they have encounters with these beings, that's the thing. They've never had the sense of that impingement before. And what I say to people is, okay, number one, it's not personal. Nobody's singling you out as Bob or Sarah or Steve or Jane. Nobody's bothered about that at that level. What they're looking at is something that you have, which is your awakening and your, as I say, humorously refer to it, your return ticket, your divinity. Because not everything that's walking around this world has that.
Yeah, and the thing is, what that brings up for me is like the thing which is most interesting is that these like seeming like negative entities can't possibly take that from you, but you can give it to them. That's the trick of consent, isn't it? To say, operating at their level, which is, and I use this word advisedly, a higher level, they are required to have our consent to have anything from us at all. So they trick us into giving away our consent, don't they? Yeah, and that's why one of the key things is because what we're describing is a process that not only happens in and over time, but it's an atemporal process that is happening outside of time. And that's why one of the key things is to really come to terms with our complicity in our own darkness. And that's something that's so hard for people to see. There's like a counter incentive that's built into that because it'll create a form of trauma. It creates a form of PTSD to see, oh my God, I must have been out of my mind or besides myself to actually be supporting this particular situation or behaving the way
because
I have.
We're asking people, aren't we, to look at something very difficult, to say, complicity, you have been involved in this, as you say, you have been giving away your consent, you have been forfeiting your divine creational abilities and handing them over to something else. Yeah, and then in doing that and feeling like you're a victim at the same time. So it's such an incredible situation, and this is so interesting because what you're describing, it makes me think of, like we were talking before we had coffee and I was saying, oh yeah, I just, much to my surprise, I've discovered the Kabbalah, which was something I was really, I had a little familiarity with, but not much, that it's actually describing the very thing that I was pointing at in my book, encoded in the darkness are actually sparks of light, and it's our role to actually discover that and to extract that light and to liberate that light. It all comes back to, in alchemy or different wisdom traditions, they'll talk about the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. That's the place where you'll all of a sudden have a living experience of that the opposites, for example, good and evil, become indistinguishable from each other, because what you discover is that, oh my God, it's by inquiring into the darkness, into this seeming evil, that actually has helped me to wake up. So wait a second, I thought this evil was
bad, but it's actually had this profoundly good effect. Well, all of a sudden, like I was saying, the opposites become really hard to distinguish one from another. And the point of view in us that has that realization is, in psychological terms, what's called the self, which is simultaneously the result of the realization and at the same time the sponsor of the realization. It's both simultaneously. And so what we're talking about is really, by just unfolding and inquiring into our process and what's being presented to us through whatever forms of dark and light are manifesting in our life, that actually becomes the medium or the vehicle for the realization of who we are. And that's really inspiring.
It is inspiring because it makes you look at the whole question of polarization and of opposites. It forces you to do that through examining one of the poles. So when we're little children, it is suggested to us through the media and through the education system that there's this linear line that stretches just as one line left and right into infinity, and on the left is evil and on the right is good.
Right.
And that isn't true. And you see these symbols like the Ouroboros, the snake consuming its own tail, and you see these spirals and you see these circles, particularly in Celtic iconography and whatnot, suggesting that there isn't any lines in the universe as such. There aren't any straight lines. There's a reason for that. And that really the polarity, when you see it as this circle, is really just points on the circle that you're drawing. And as you shift round, you say, well, actually, there aren't two separate areas on this circle. There is only one artifact. There is just one thing. And it goes round and round on itself. And so where we draw the lines is sort of arbitrary. And what we're really doing is mapping the whole thing. And as you come to that, you start to realise that being given the opportunity to look at extreme positivity and joyousness and bliss and creativeness and revelation and epiphany and whatnot, all those wonderful things which New Agers are addicted to, they have a dependency on those things. And then you have the destructive, self-sabotaging dependency at the other end of the scale. It is as if one is given the opportunity to walk that whole perimeter and say, right, now I have mapped polarity. Now I can tell you I have been to the bottom, I have been to the top. Both wrong answers. Both wrong answers. That's not it. It's not the caves under the mountain. It's not the peak at the top of the mountain. It's something else. It's something in the centre. It's something in the core. And as human beings, we're given the opportunity in this third density realm, which is a place where polarization is put upon us for our own good, for our own benefit, as a gift, as a device of education, I think. And the sooner you realise that it is you who determine that point of equilibrium and that centre point, the less you feel dragged and the less gravitation there is to say, oh God, I must pursue happiness and joy and bliss all the time, or I must fight evil with my magic wand or whatever. You're not drawn into those deceptive endeavours anymore. You realise that that is part of the teaching to say polarisation isn't real. It's a device, it's a third density temporal device to teach you about consciousness. It doesn't have reality. And so throwing yourself into conflict, as well intended as you think that might be, is foolish.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it makes me think, hearing you talk about, that's an example of like encoded within this seeming problem. In other words, polarization is actually some form of teaching or some form of blessing. And again, I find myself contemplating that, at least in my own work. And just also hearing you talk, Neil, like I feel like what we're doing is an example of what I wanted to talk about next, which is, it's all fine and dandy for one person to have some form of lucidity and awakening and realization and all that, but there's something about when you actually come together and connect and hang out with other people who are also awakening to the dreamlike nature, and you're able to, it's what I call to conspire, to co-inspire each other, like the two of us are doing right now. And this is, in Tibetan Buddhism, they'll talk about the Sangha, the community, the three jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, the teacher, the teaching, and the Sangha is the community. And I don't think of it in a traditional way of just people coming together who are practicing, Tibetan Buddhism, My favorite definition of the word bodhisattva is a being in the process of awakening. And who among us is not in the process of awakening? And when you connect with each other, in that way where you actually experience, oh wow, if I actually am helping this other seemingly other person awaken, I actually get as much benefit as they do because ultimately we're not separate. Then all of a sudden we can continually help each other to discover that we're all on the same side. We can activate the collective genius in a way where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's really what's being offered to us through this evolutionary impulse that we're participating in, and that's being offered to us by the cosmos, is to actually come together and connect with each other, help each other to awaken. It's what I call to dream ourselves awake. And one way to understand that is through the creative imagination. It's just imagine, you're in a dream at night and you have lucidity. You've woken up to the nature of your situation that you're dreaming. Okay, that's great, but yet there are all these other dream characters in the dream, aspects of yourself, but imagine connecting with another one of them who's also becoming lucid. And imagine connecting with 10 others of yourself, or 100 or 500, and they're all just parts of yourself that are actually awakening to the nature of your situation, which is that you're in a dream. And you imagine coming together and you actually contemplate together what you're realizing. That is, that this universe you're in is just a function of your own dreaming, of your own consciousness. That's when you discover you can actually configure yourselves together, activate what I call our creative power, the sacred power of dreaming, and actually change the dream. And what I just described in the night dream, that's what's available to us in the waking dream.
That's a very powerful thought for a lot of people to think about. It brings to mind a very practical question as well, which is people intellectually will go with the idea that we're not separate and that we're all one, and namaste and hello, another me,
and all this and all that, right?
Yeah, and say, oh, Paul Levy, he's my favourite piece of me. He's a great entity, right. Component, great. And we have a certain privilege in the way we've decided to create our life, which is we meet with other people who speak philosophically and spiritually and metaphysically and all these things quite often.
Mm-hmm.
And we communicate and email and everything like everyone else, but we meet as well. We meet with people, right, in the flesh. Do you think that's important?
Yeah. I totally think that's important. I mean, I think there's an actual teaching of the Buddha where he basically, some sutra where it's basically translated as don't hang out with fools. And the idea being that it's really important who you hang out with and who your company is. And in the sense that it's kind of like a contagious energy. When you hang out with people who are really asleep, and particularly there's something that happens when you bring our species together where we all inform and influence and affect each other, and it's almost like we reinforce each other's either awakening and or unconsciousness, and in a way where we feed off of and into each other's unconsciousness or awakening. And so when you hang out with a group of people who are actually asleep, yeah, if your awakening is really stabilized, it's not really going to affect you. But if your awakening is kind of not that stable, you might find yourself over time getting more and more drawn into that level of inertia or asleepness or amnesia. So I think it's really important to hang out with people who are also in the process of awakening, because then you discover we can actually really reinforce and support each other's process of realization, which is simultaneously helping our own. It's this reciprocal process, and that's the way I really understand the real mystic process of the Sangha, the community of the Buddha.
I'm glad you said that so incisively. I think it's important for us not to pussyfoot around on this issue, not that you and I would do, but I have found it increasingly important to look people in the eye and say, yes, we must get together, we must meet. As I say, for me, that's not a problem. My problem is the opposite, which is politely telling people I'm not going to meet them, I haven't got time, right, or I want my time to myself or whatever. But I'll tell you, 9 out of 10 people who I work with, one of their challenges is that they're stuck in an environment, a place, a world, a family, a business, a community or something where there is no awakening going on. There are not people in that place interested in the process of growth and evolution and consciousness. They're not interested, right? Some of them might be religious, some of them might be very hyper intelligent, academically very impressive, and have PhDs coming out of every orifice, you know.
Right.
But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about astute, urbane, sophisticated, cultured people. That's something different. That's great, but that's something different. We're talking about people who are acknowledging a very fundamental aspect of reality in themselves. And I have to say to those people, it's important that we gather, that you gather with people, that you meet people who are doing the same thing you are. People earlier on in the journey than you, people later on in the journey, people exactly from your ethnic and cultural background, and people from totally different ones. If for nothing else, to share openly, to let your guard down, to be in a trusting environment where you can be absolutely free and open and together, and everyone's going to support and be excellent about that. And that means travel. Because unless you have the advantage of living in a place where there's a lot of consciousness, which I'm glad to say you and I have chosen rather well where we live, but there's an awful lot of places in America and in Europe where that isn't the case, where there's a great dearth of awareness. And I have to observe, I'd love to hear what you think about this, Paul, I have to observe that the land itself seems to promote consciousness and evolution and awakening in certain parts of the world. And I can look at the Pacific Northwest, for example, and even in places where they're not articulating in the way that we are now, I can feel the arising of consciousness. I can feel the lucidity increasing. I can feel it, even when people aren't saying anything about it. And then I'll go to another part of the world. I'm not going to name them because some wonderful people listening to this might live there. It doesn't matter really, but you know what I mean. There's other parts of the world and you go, this place is just flat. It's kind of dead.
Dense,
and the community is like not interested, and the land is sort of lying asleep as well.
I had this whole awakening based on the incredible trauma and wounding and abuse and all that, a long time ago in the early 80s. And so the experience I was having was I was really beginning to realize, oh my God, this is a dream. This is a mass shared dream. We're dreaming up reality moment by moment. And then I realized, okay, great, that, and at that point, it was probably a quarter that could get me a cup of coffee. Like, what was I going to do to make a living, to support myself in this dream? And so many people I know, and you'll see how this connects to what you were just saying, so many people I know are going through the same process. They're having some form of realization, of lucidity, of awakening, but they're really struggling with how can they then be in the world in a way and, to bring income to support them that's in alignment with who they're discovering they are and the situation they've discovered they're in, which is that we're having a dream. And I think about me, so I was really struggling with that, and then I just got creative and was like, well, if this is a dream, I completely can easily imagine that, don't you think the dream would support me in if I somehow brought forth a creative vehicle for not just telling people, but showing people how this is a dream. And I was able to figure that out by having these groups of people that I would bring together who were all subscribing to whatever degree they were that were having a dream. We would inquire into the nature of our situation through that lens, that we were dreaming up whatever was happening and what does that show us when we view things in that way. And it was actually really giving people the living experience of lucidity. And as I began doing that, the very day I began doing that, I began making a living. And not only that, but more and more, I began attracting other people who were awakening. And so then I began to realize, oh my God, I'm actually invoking or creating in my dream a whole community of fellow awakening beings who we all could support each other. So yeah, I think you're right. There are certain places in the third dimension on our planet that might have a denser environment and there's not so much the energy of awakening. But then from another point of view, there's nothing separate from consciousness itself. So why not just create the very thing you're wanting to dream up, which is to like actually creatively invoke and attract a whole form of awakened community in your life. And so I just wanted to offer that thought form.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The way I perceive it is that I think you're right. I think the sort of organic internet that links these minds together is there, and there's no doubt about it. And technology helps with that. There's no question about that. But I still have to impress upon you the idea that there are places where it's easier than others.
Oh yeah, no, so, I agree with that. I'm not disagreeing at all.
People who are in, let me give you a practical example. Yeah. People who are in France at the moment are telling me, in France, there's always exceptions, there's always communities who are most wonderful and superb, of course, but on the whole in France people are not interested in this stuff, which is ironic because in the esoteric traditions it was a great hotbed of activity, France and Germany, right, and so on. But at the moment there is a dampening in that region. There is a great dampening of that.
Sure.
And some people who have travelled from France to Northern California and wonderful Oregon and Washington have said, oh my God, I can feel it when I got here.
Right.
Or they went to whatever. They went to Glastonbury, which is a little bit new agey in England, but wonderful place with a great landscape in Somerset. And now they went to Avebury or West Kennet Longbarrow and they saw the crop circle. Wow, we can feel it here. And when we got there, we met with other people who were doing the same thing. And then we went home again. And that's one of the problems that I brush up against all the time is that, and then we went home again. Right. So they created the experience, they made it happen. They edited the dream. They changed the circumstances of the dream. They had a wonderful experience, and you must come across this. People go away for a couple of weeks. They go to a conference. Yeah. They visit somebody. They do and they raise the vibration, as they say. They get to this wonderful place, and then they go home again, and all that falls back down on the floor. So they can't sustain the notion that they're steering the dream. They can't keep that belief alive.
Yeah, and that what you're just describing, I mean, yeah, I really hear that, and I come across that too. And as you well know, part of being a spiritual practitioner, almost like an alchemist, is that it's our responsibility, to really, we're the ones who are co-dreaming the dream. We're like the artists or the authors who are the, we're authoring the story of our life. And yeah, I totally get there are certain places that are of a more like dense or flat vibration, but then I would also just offer the thought form of that, yeah, it's our responsibility to, in a way, alchemically transmute whatever place we're in or whatever experience we're having into some form of seeing the dream or seeing it as some form of teaching or a blessing or a spiritual realm. That, you see, the way I understand spiritual practice is more and more you're able to, in a way, to alchemically transmute every moment of your experience into that.
That is such an important thing. I'm so glad that we raised this. One of the things I've learned from what I've been doing over the last goodness knows how many years is that, yes, it is possible to bring that awareness into the most unpromising situations and the most decrepit environments or horrible streets or real places of political polarization and ignorance and bigotry and whatnot. And I can go in those places and change that. And I do my best at that. I'm not perfect at it. I'm still learning about that. And I see that alchemy being very possible because I've seen it in my own life. And walking around the streets of New York or whatever in very unpromising, spiritually flat situations. And then I'll meet someone who is just astonishingly excellent. We'll have a great conversation. Someone else will come along. Something will happen. I'll see these signs and symbols and synchronicities in the environment. And I realise that I am co-authoring this narrative, this dream narrative, as I'm going along. What I'm saying to you is that it's really a matter of experience. That it's an experiential method one has to pass on to our students, if I can use that word for a moment, or our colleagues or whatever. The joy for me is where one has the luxury of working on a long-term basis with somebody who comes back and back over time, and they are starting to believe, it's also a very problematic word, but we'll use it for the moment, they're starting to believe in their own power. They're starting to observe the example of our behaviour when we're on top form. As you say, it falls upon us to demonstrate by our example, by our deeds, not just our words, because we're both very comfortable with that, but by our deeds, how we live, what we do, how we've changed our dream.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because as you're talking, Neil, I'm thinking that, so I have all these groups, like we both work with people, so we're not just like these philosophers sitting in a white tower. One of the things I see, almost everybody, even people who are really awakening, but almost everybody, they come into the groups and they're somewhat entranced via the experience of thinking that whatever they're perceiving is objectively actually happening, which is very different than the understanding of whatever we're perceiving, who knows what actually is happening. I'm not in the position to know what's happening, but I'm in a position to know what I'm perceiving is happening. That's very different than, this is what's objectively happening. So on the one hand, so many of us are entranced by this seeming objectivity of what they're seeing. But the other thing I wanted to bring in, which I think is an important just thought form maybe for contemplation as we approach the end of our dialogue together, and I always go back to the dreaming, in a dream. If you're in a night dream and you hold a particular viewpoint, whatever the viewpoint is, the dream, which is nothing other than an actual reflection of your own mind, will have no choice but to spontaneously shapeshift and instantaneously reflect back the change in viewpoint. So, or whatever your viewpoint is before you've even changed it. So the idea being is that if you have a particular viewpoint in the dream, you're going to dream up the dream to offer you evidence to confirm the viewpoint. And then you become entranced thinking, well, no, it's correct what I'm seeing. It's obviously objectively happening because now I have proof that's confirming to me the actual objective truth of what I'm seeing, which makes you even more entrenched in seeing it through that viewpoint, which then instantaneously brings even more evidence in a self-perpetuating feedback loop where we become entranced by the genius of our own capacity to create reality.
That's the thing that I try and share with the people I work with, which is if somebody says to me, we appreciate your knowledge, we appreciate your philosophy, but, I'm stuck here in North Dakota, there's nobody to talk to, there's nobody interested, there's no community. Well, that's because that is what you're exploring in your narrative. The reality that you're manufacturing is one of isolation. You are exploring separation. You have created a real, in quotes, life where you are isolated. You are on your own. You are separated. It is difficult. And that is what you've created. So there's no argument there. But do not doubt for a moment that you couldn't up sticks, go somewhere else, and be bombarded with wonderfulness and dynamism and colour and enlightenment and sharing of the most juicy and wonderful kind, if you so desired. And that's the thing, is that knowingness that is available. And that takes practice, doesn't it? You can't just flip the switch on
it's
that.
It's not just something that's an intellectual insight, but it definitely, that's why in Tibetan Buddhism, I do hours of what's called practice every day. It's like, it's something that you just can't study in a book or like even imagine or just intellectually understand, but it is a form of real practice.
And that's the nub of it, isn't it? You can't do it with normal consciousness of just frontal intellectual mind. You have to shift the channel. You have to change gear and say, right, the bit where the editing's done, the bit where the changes happen requires a different mode of consciousness, and that requires discipline.
Yeah, it definitely requires discipline. And then, it just makes me think, too, that when we, each of us individually, develop the discipline and the structure and develop and deepen our practice, whatever our practice is, doesn't make a difference if it's Buddhism or, being an artist or whatever. It makes me want to just not forget to say, I offer to people the thought form that, we, as we wake up to who we are, that we are the artists and the dreamers of our shared collective dream, that we can create what I call an art happening called global awakening. in which we actually dream ourselves awake. And that's not just some sort of like woo-woo, like new agey philosophy. That's actually what this whole thing is about. That's actually what's being offered to us, and that we can really connect with each other. Because one other way of describing what this whole thing is about is for each of us to, in a way, see through the illusion or step out of the separate self and to recognize, wow, we only exist not alien from each other, but related to each other, and that there's actually no separation between any of us. And as that realization spreads non-locally through the field, we then are actually potentially offered the role of changing the dream, which is, the evolution in action. And I just really wanted to offer that is something that is really being offered to us, that's available to us. And it's not available to us in the future like, oh, it's available to us right now, that we can really step into this and find our own creative voice and connect with our own genius, our own, they call it the daimon, the guiding voice, the inner spirit, which helps us this etymologically. We then find our calling, our vocation, all these wonderful things. But if we turn away from that daimon, from that inner voice, that guiding spirit, it becomes negative and becomes a demon.
Going full circle back to what we started talking about at the top of this discussion, what happened for me in 2012 is that cycle, that shift between the thought form and the manifestation, or the imaginal reality tunnel and the so-called consensus reality tunnel, the gap between the two halved. So I think now there's been an acceleration, a natural acceleration in this part of the system, in this part of the conscious game, to show us the reality of what you're saying, to say, okay, if you have trouble believing this, let me give you a helping hand. I will now halve the time that it takes for a thought form to become a piece of reality, as one would describe.
Yeah, and I would say that what you just described, I would say, that's all just your imagination.
Well, listen, I have seen that the gap between the imaginal and the actual is non-existent. It's all a matter of consensus.
Yeah.
That has occurred, and if for those dwelling and exploring the negative, that has definitely occurred, because it's smashed up right to the nose. And those pursuing truth or unfoldment or awakening are starting to see positive changes in their life. Things are actually shifting. I think that's the gift of this part of the cycle, is that only for those with a tremendous, what you might use a slightly old word, faith in this, have been having the consistency to live like that and take risks with the life and not live as normal grown-ups do, like you and I live a different kind of life. We've taken a risk to do that because we had faith in that process. For those who might not quite have had the luxury or power or privilege or choice of that faith, nevertheless, the universe is saying, let me make it really easy for you. I will now increase the power of thought as a manifest force in the universe, just so you can really see it. So temporality, the mechanics of time, has changed. 2013 is different to last year.
So many people I hear, just coming back to the 2012 thing, are saying, time is quickening.
It is. But it's not, if I might suggest, it feels like time is quickening. What it is that the distance between thought and manifestation is a lot smaller. That gives the impression that time is whizzing by like nobody's business.
And the thing which is interesting is that, so then when you think about time, and who is Father Time but the negative father Chronos, like chronology or chronometer, and the idea that, that's the negative father, in a way the antonym or the antidote to Chronos is synchronos, is synchronicity. Is the realm where all of a sudden, you begin to discover, wow, time is not in a sense linear, but like, wow, I'm having an inner experience, and it's like the universe is shapeshifting and configuring itself to actually reveal and express my inner experience. Like there's no difference between the inner and the outer. And so there's something, kind of breaking out of the spell of time that's really important. When I told that story about, I was having this awakening to the dreamlike nature, and how can I make a living? Let me teach that it's all a dream, and wouldn't you think the dream would support me? When I was doing that, I had to really, really trust that. I couldn't just be like 3/4 of the time, teaching this as a dream, and then the rest of the time just like, not being sure. No, I had to fully step into that. I had to fully go over that edge and step in into that dimension.
That is so true. I had the same experience as well, which is when I tried to hedge my bets, as it were, and I thought, well, I'll be 50% spiritual and 50% commercial, and then I'll change it to 70-30, and then it never quite hung together, it never quite happened. It required me, and I have this expression, to step off the train altogether. I had to get off. The train disappeared into the distance, and I'm stood there with the wind whistling around my feet thinking, well, now I've done it. Now I've really done it.
Right.
Let's see what happens. And blessed be, it's given me what I need. Sometimes I don't always get the things I want, but I do have the things I need.
Right.
And that mechanism, I'm pretty sure, is exactly the same for all human entities. Exactly the same, because it runs through one seam of consciousness, this abundance of the universe, this provision of the universe. I mean, that's a whole conversation in itself. But let us draw this to a close, and thank you for inviting me into your home. It's been great to have this
is so fun. I mean, I just so love just hanging out with you and just contemplating together. I feel like so totally activated and inspired, and
it's nice to get new vectors and new language on it as well. So there's a couple of things that you said, I thought, oh yeah, that is a great way of describing it, and that will go into my dialogue now.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of doing this, is that we sharpen our blade.
Yeah, exactly. No, I just so appreciate
we might have to do this again soon.
Yeah, I think so. Totally. That would
Brilliant.
be so fun.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, Neil, thank you. Totally.